Thanks for stopping by. In this video, I'll examine themes from director Stanley Kubrick's 1964 Cold War satire, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. If you like this video, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel, The Godfather of Cinema, where you'll find more movie analysis such as this one in my playlist, Cinema Geeks. I would also appreciate it if you would leave a thumbs up and a comment letting me know what you think of this video, and I would also appreciate you hitting the bell under this video to be notified of videos I will be uploading in the future. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II, the United States of America and Russia engaged in a so-called Cold War for global domination through proxy wars, propaganda, embargoes, sporting events, technological innovations, foreign aid, the space race, and finally the arms race. To defend itself from a Soviet nuclear sneak attack, America's Strategic Air Command maintains a large fleet of airborne B-52 bombers over the Antarctic Ocean. Each of these 40 bombers contains 50 megatons of nuclear explosives equal to 16 times every bomb and shell used in World War II. And each of these 40 bombers are only 2 hours from their targets inside of Russia. Russia, on the other hand, has a deterrent of its own, a secret weapon buried somewhere on Zogg Island in the East Siberian Sea. As to why Russia chose to place their weapon in such a cold and desolate place is unknown. At Burleson Air Force Base, commander of the 843rd Bombing Wing, Jack D. Ripper, receives an epiphany during the act of sexual intercourse. Women, he realizes, want to make him weak, and the Russians are contaminating America's drinking water with fluoride. Ripper lives by the motto, shoot first and ask questions later. So in order to keep women from depleting his manhood and Russia from impurifying America's precious bodily fluids, Commander Jack D. Ripper orders the entire fleet of bombers under his command to launch a preemptive nuclear attack against Russia. The normal radios in the bombers headed to Russia are switched over to a special receiver that is designed to ignore orders that are not preceded by a recall code. The national security of both superpowers have always depended upon mutually assured destruction, or MAD, in the event of a full-scale nuclear war. The arms race ensures that both nations, America and the Soviet Union, possess equal nuclear retaliatory capabilities, which takes the advantage away from either side starting a nuclear war. In addition to this, Russia possesses an automated nuclear strategy called the Doomsday device that, once triggered, cannot be untriggered. Fortunately, Jack D. Ripper knows the recall code to stop the American bombers from launching a surprise nuclear attack against Russia. Unfortunately, however, Jack D. Ripper proves that he is a committed and disciplined soldier by shooting himself in the head to eliminate any possibility of averting nuclear Armageddon. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is directed and produced by Stanley Kubrick and distributed by Columbia Pictures. The film script is co-written by Stanley Kubrick, Terry Southern, and Peter George, loosely based on George's 1958 novel Red Alert. The cinematography of Dr. Strangelove is by Gilbert Taylor, and its editing is by Anthony Harvey. Shot at Shepperton Studios in Surrey, England, the film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director for Stanley Kubrick, Best Adapted Screenplay for Kubrick and Terry Southern, and Best Actor for Peter Sellers. The film stars Sterling Hayden, Peter Sellers, George C. Scott, Slim Pickens, Keenan Wynn, and James Earl Jones. Here are the themes I will cover in this video.
Communist indoctrination.
Insult.
I do deny them my essence.
The Soviets have a doomsday device hidden underground in a remote area among the Zarkov Islands. Why the Soviets would conceal their weapon in such a place and the nature of the weapon itself are mysteries. Jack D. Ripper is commander of the Strategic Air Command's 843rd Wing, which maintains 40 B-52 bombers that are airborne 24 hours a day, just 2 hours from their targets inside of Russia. Each bomber contains 50 megatons of nuclear explosives, or 16 times all of the explosives used by all of the armies in World War II. Ripper orders Group Captain Lionel Mandrake to confiscate all of the radios on the base. Ripper then orders the 843rd Wing to penetrate Soviet airspace. Ripper's reason for ordering the strike, he tells Mandrake, is that Russia has launched a nuclear sneak attack on America. In the event that a Russian nuclear sneak attack takes out the U.S. president, Attack Plan R assigns the power to order a nuclear counterstrike to a lower echelon commander. Once this lower echelon commander issues the go code, the radios of the entire 843rd Wing are all rerouted to a device called CRM-114 that is designed to cut the B-52 bombers off from any attempt by the enemy to issue fake or conflicting orders. Only those messages containing the correct three-letter code prefix can order the bombers to pull out of bombing Russia. Russia did not attack America at all. To the contrary, it is Ripper who launches a surprise attack on Russia because Russia, he believes, is sneaking fluoride into America's water supplies. Ripper came up with his theory after the act of lovemaking left him feeling weak. Being second in command under the president and the only person who knows the recall code, General Ripper believes that confiscating all of the radios on the base will keep the enemy from sending conflicting and confusing orders to the soldiers under his command, who will have no choice but to follow his orders all the way to completion. Between 1945 and 1959, the United States and the Soviet Union recruited Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians following Germany's defeat in World War II. Of the 1,600 Nazis that the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff recruited, one of those Nazis was responsible for developing a weapon specifically designed to destroy American cities. Wernher von Braun was the key architect behind America's space program, NASA, and as a former Nazi, he developed the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, the Saturn V2 rocket, which was specifically designed to destroy American cities. So what does America recruiting a Nazi scientist like Wernher von Braun have to do with Ripper's belief that Russia is poisoning America's water? Ripper's fear of Russian invasion and contaminated water are synonymous with the weakness he feels after having sex. And since Ripper also claims that he denies women his essence, which is also synonymous with his C, the recall code POE, which stands for purity of essence, explains why Ripper orders soldiers under his command to protect the air base from Russian imposters disguised as U.S. soldiers. Ripper's theory that communists are secretly adding fluoride to America's water supplies also explains his fear of having his purity of essence or seed taken or depleted during the act of love. And in addition to denying women his essence, Ripper also warns the soldiers under his command at the Air Force Base not to trust anyone, to fire on anyone or anything within 200 yards of the base, and to shoot first and ask questions later. For it is better to lose a few soldiers through accident than to lose the entire base through the type of carelessness that is demonstrated by Buck Turgidson, who jeopardizes national security by allowing his secretary secretary, Miss Scott, to use his red telephone, which also happens to be his direct line to the president. And then there is President Muffley, who invites a Russian spy claiming to be Russia's ambassador into the war room. Therefore, Turgidson and President Muffley letting down their defenses and compromising national security is tantamount to Russia in purifying America's precious bodily fluids with fluoride, as well as America recruiting its former enemy in the form of Wernher von Braun to develop its space program. President Merkin Muffley debriefs Air Force General Buck Turgidson, who was the only person to speak with Commander Ripper prior to Ripper sending the 843rd Wing to bomb Russia and putting the base at Burleson on lockdown. Despite the fact that only the president can authorize a nuclear strike, an emergency clause called Plan R gives the second in chain of command the authority to order a counterstrike in the event that a Russian sneak attack takes out the president. Let's think of Plan R as a human being in which the first in chain of command or the head replaces the tail, and the second in chain of command or the tail replaces the head. The head in this metaphor would be the president and the tail would be Jack D. Ripper, ordering soldiers to shoot first and ask questions later, such as children and adolescents who act on impulse without exercising forethought or self-discipline. In this film, the actions of General Turgidson and President Muffley are controlled not by their heads but by lower echelon impulses or commanders, which makes them careless, weak, and vulnerable to infiltration and deception. Proverbs 25 and verse 28. Whoever has no rule over his spirit is like a city broken down without walls. Also Matthew 26 and verse 41. Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. In his farewell speech on January the 17th, 1961, President Eisenhower said that the U.S. military must be ready for instant action so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. This statement sums up MAD, or mutually assured destruction, which is based on the military principle that neither side will use weapons of mass destruction if neither side possesses the capacity to defend itself against weapons of mass destruction. Later in his speech, Eisenhower warned America that it must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower would not have issued this type of warning if generals like Jack D. Ripper did not exist in real life, but truth can sometimes be stranger than fiction. For instance, in 1962, President John F. Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a plan to orchestrate a series of violent false flag attacks called Operation Northwoods, in which the U.S. government would assassinate Cuban immigrants, sink boats containing Cuban refugees on the high seas, hijack U.S. commercial planes, blow up a U.S. ship, as well as attack U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. All of these activities were to be blamed on Cuba to justify going to war. This plan was signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Lyman Lemnitzer and sent to the Secretary of Defense. The previously secret document was originally made public on November 19, 1997 by the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board. Then there is Operation Mongoose, a plan drawn up by Brigadier General William H. Craig, which outlined a series of activities to provoke, harass, and disrupt the Cuban government and its leader Fidel Castro. Then there is Five-Star General, Field Marshal of the Philippine Army, Medal of Honor recipient, and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, Douglas MacArthur, who said in a 1954 interview that of the 20 major wars he waged throughout his career, the war he regretted not waging was the U.S.'s war with Korea, a war he insisted that he could have won in 10 days by dropping 30 to 50 atomic bombs on air bases and depots throughout Manchuria. It was his plan to spread a belt of radioactive cobalt that would have left the country lifeless for at least 60 years. And speaking of nuclear warfare, there is also U.S. Air Force General Curtis Emerson LeMay, who wanted to use nuclear bombs in the Vietnam War, and in 1949 wanted to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. And then there is U.S. Air Force General and Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Air Command, Thomas Power, who saw action in World War II as a member of the 304th Bomb Wing in North Africa and Italy. Returning to the United States in 1944, the general was named commander of the 314th Bomb Wing in Guam as part of the 21st Bomber Command. When a RAND study came out suggesting that the U.S. limits nuclear strikes at the outset of a hypothetical war with the Soviet Union, Power scoffed at this idea, saying, "Why are you so concerned with saving lives?" He even went on to say that the whole idea is to kill the bastards. At the end of the war, there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win. Note how similar Power's statement here is to one by Nazi Hermann Göring, who said that it doesn't matter if we, meaning the Luftwaffe, which was the Nazis' equivalent to the U.S. Air Force, have only 1 plane and 1 man left, so long as victory is ours. Early in the film, General Ripper orders Group Captain Lionel Mandrake to confiscate all of the radios from all of the soldiers on the base so that they can be focused on killing the Russians who are attempting to overtake the base. What the soldiers at the base do not know is that they are shooting it out with fellow members of the U.S. Army and not the Russians. The fighting is fierce. However, the soldiers on the base are quickly defeated and captured. In a sense, Ripper's capture is a metaphor of the first failed attempt to stop the American bomber from triggering the Doomsday device later in the film. For as the Doomsday device is triggered by an attack, Ripper's decision to issue Plan R to the 843rd Wing to attack Russia is also triggered by a perceived threat, which is Russia polluting America's water supply with fluoride, an idea that Ripper developed during the act of sex in which he experienced a profound sense of fatigue and emptiness. Therefore, to avoid these feelings and to protect the integrity of his essence or bodily fluids, Ripper commits suicide by shooting himself in the head to avoid being captured and tortured into giving up the recall code. His suicide is a form of decapitation, symbolizing his belief that war is too important to be left to politicians, since Plan R gives him, second in chain of command, the power to not only authorize a counterstrike, but to also separate the head or president from the body, which would in this metaphor be the bombers, by switching the radios of the planes over to the CRM-114, a device that is designed not to receive messages unless those messages contain the correct 3-letter code prefix, which is also a metaphor of Ripper's decision to confiscate all of the radios on the base to keep his soldiers from receiving orders that conflict with his orders. Attack Plan R should also be interpreted as the conflict between man's rational mind and his natural impulses such as fear, hunger, greed, selfishness, the need for love, food, sex, and security. Genesis 3 and verse 7. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. Also Genesis 3 and verse 10. Adam said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. Of all animals on earth, man is the only creature that expresses its shame of being an animal by wearing clothes to conceal the fact that he is, in spite of his superior thinking brain, not unlike any other animal. Take, for instance, the act of sex, during which advanced cognitive processes such as analytical reasoning, self-discipline, objectivity, common sense, and morality take a backseat to basic and sometimes illogical impulses such as the sex drive, as illustrated by Buck Turgidson, who allows his secretary, Miss Scott, to use his red telephone, which also happens to be his direct line to the president. Now let's return to Dr. Strangelove, where President Muffley wants to pull back the B-52 bombers that Ripper deployed to bomb Russia. But it is too late because the normal radios on the bombers are switched over to the CRM-114 receiver, which is designed to ignore messages that are not preceded by the correct three-letter prefix that only Ripper knows. President Muffley invites the Russian ambassador into the war room, where the ambassador warns the president that Russia has a doomsday device that is designed to destroy all life on Earth if provoked by an attack. The president turns to his director of weapons research and development and former Nazi, Dr. Strangelove, for a second opinion. According to Dr. Strangelove, the doomsday device is not only real, but it is also an automated and irrevocable decision-making system that rules out human meddling, analogous to Jack the Ripper committing suicide to keep from being tortured into giving up the recall code, as well as analogous to the cord being severed on Ripper's direct phone to the president, which prevents Mandrake from calling Strategic Air Command with the recall code. There is no way to stop the bombers from attacking Russia, as there is no way to untrigger the doomsday device after it has been triggered, and as there is no way to untrigger an orgasm once it has been reached. For remember that an orgasm is the sudden discharge of pent-up sexual excitement during the sexual response cycle. Remember also that reflexes are automatic motor responses which operate outside of perceptual thinking. Therefore, as a woman responding to sexual stimulation, so too are the bombs of the doomsday machine, concealed and yet triggered to automatically respond or explode when provoked or stimulated by another bomb. This metaphor of how the doomsday device works also applies to why Dr. Strangelove cannot control his withered hand at the end of the film. More on this later. Now let's look at the fleet of bombers under General Ripper's command. After he issues the go code to attack Russia, the radios in the bombers are switched over to the CRM-114 receiver, which blocks out all outside messages except those messages containing the correct three-letter prefix. Therefore, as long as Ripper can retain control of his body during the act of sex, he can deny women his power, and likewise, as long as President Muffley can communicate with the bombers, he can recall them. However, President Muffley cannot recall the bombers due to the fact that their normal radios under Plan R have been rerouted to the CRM-114 receiver, and Ripper is the only one who knows the code. Mandrake deciphers the recall code out of some random notes from Ripper's notepad and phones the president, who relays the code to the Strategic Air Command, who in turn relays the code to the planes Ripper deployed to bomb Russia. All but 4 of the bombers receive the order and pull out. Russia fires missiles at the 4 remaining bombers. One of the bombers survives the missile strike, but its CRM-114 receiver is destroyed, which blocks it from receiving the recall code to abort its mission. And in addition to destroying the bomber's CRM-114 receiver, the missile attack has also ruptured the plane's fuel tank, which is leaking badly. Realizing that they cannot reach their primary target, Major Kong selects a closer target and flies the plane at a lower altitude to avoid Russian radar and to pull off a sneak attack. With these two concepts in mind, let's return to Dr. Strangelove. But let's remember that Attack Plan R empowers a lower echelon commander to order a nuclear counterstrike in the event that the normal chain of command is disrupted or decapitated by a surprise first strike. Therefore, it should be crystal clear by now that the lower echelon commander in the Plan R metaphor is everything from the neck down. It should also be crystal clear that as an automated and irrevocable decision decision-making system, the doomsday device is comparable to an orgasm, which cannot be stopped, delayed, or controlled in any way after being triggered. It should also be crystal clear that the Russian radar picking up the U.S. planes in its airspace is a metaphor of women sensing Ripper's power during the act of love. Therefore, Cohn's decision to fly the bomber under Russia's radar in order to pull off a sneak attack is analogous to Ripper's attempt to enjoy women without giving them his quote-unquote essence. Remember, Ripper is convinced that Russia is putting fluoride in America's water, which he interpreted from the fatigue and emptiness he feels after making love, a correlation which also made him realize that women as well as Russia are really after his power. This brings us back to the Plan R provision that gives a lower echelon commander the power to order a nuclear counterstrike in the event that the president is taken out by a Russian sneak attack. Also remember that once the American bombers penetrate Soviet airspace, those bombers cannot turn back and must complete the mission, due to the fact that the normal radios in the bombers are switched over to the CRM-114 receiver, which is designed as the autonomic nervous system, and the human body is designed to block out distractions. Recall now previous comparisons I made between the bomber's damaged CRM-114 receiver and the act of love, in which areas of the brain corresponding with self-control, fear, and anxiety are switched off during an orgasm. Therefore, the damaged CRM-114 receiver and orgasms are both symbolic of Ripper's belief that war decisions should not be left to politicians. Or to put this another way, there are some instances in which the act of thinking gets in the way, which is a principle correlating to the basic principle by which the doomsday device and orgasms work, by canceling out the possibility of human meddling. The damaged CRM-114 receiver is also symbolic of Ripper confiscating the radios of the soldiers at the Air Force Base at Burleson. Confiscating the radios cuts off the possibility of any outside interference. Additionally, confiscating the soldiers' radios keeps them ignorant to the fact that Ripper lied to them about Russia attacking America. Again, let's recap by taking attack plan R, the missile strike, the B-52 bomber dropping to a lower altitude in order to conserve fuel and evade Russian radar detection, the jammed bomb door of the B-52 bomber, and comparing these elements in the film with the act of making love. Both attack plan Alfa Romeo and the bombers penetrating Russia's airspace are metaphors for the initiation of sexual intercourse. Next, the Russians fire a missile that damages the bomber's CRM-114 receiver. Consequently, the plane cannot receive any orders conflicting with its original order to nuke Russia. Other elements in the film, such as the doomsday machine, the soldiers on the base that have no radios and no way of communicating with the outside world, and the broken line on Ripper's direct telephone to the president, are metaphors of both the damaged CRM-114 receiver and the act of love, in which the areas in the brain corresponding with intelligence, self-discipline, fear, and anxiety are disabled. A transcendent state that neuroscientist Gert Holstege describes as a void between consciousness and unconsciousness that not only renders women powerless, but that can also disconnect them from both the outside world and their own emotional feelings. In addition to destroying the plane's CRM-114 receiver, the Russian missile strike also ruptures the plane's fuel tank, resulting in a leak. This is a metaphor for premature ejaculation. Due to the plane's fuel tank leak, Major Cohn selects the closer target at the ICBM complex at Karlosk while flying the plane underneath Russian radar. Selecting a closer target to drop his bomb while flying lower to avoid Russian radar are Cohn's attempts to complete the mission that Ripper gave him, as well as Ripper's attempt to prolong sexual intercourse without ejaculating and giving up his power. Due to the damage caused by the Russian missile strike, Major Kong has to manually open the bomb doors to release the bomb from the plane. Now recall Ripper's belief that Russia is contaminating America's drinking water. Also recall Ripper admitting that he has sex with women without giving them his essence. The bomber's jammed door, therefore, is analogous with Ripper trying to stop himself from ejaculating. But by now the power to do so is beyond his control, for in ordering the Strategic Air Command to bomb Russia under Plan R and then going on to confiscate all of the radios on the base to keep his soldiers both ignorant and focused, and then shooting himself in the head to avoid being tortured into giving up the recall code. And doing all of these things, Ripper ejaculates, metaphorically speaking, by abdicating his right mind, as President Merkin Muffley also ejaculates in the same sense by abdicating his right mind, by inviting a Russian spy into the war room, both of which are comparable to one experiencing an actual orgasm, which shuts off intellectual and rational circuits in the brain corresponding with self-discipline, objectivity, and common sense. As I've so far demonstrated, the fluoridated water in Ripper's Russian conspiracy theory is analogous to enemy infiltration, such as in the cases involving Miss Scott using Buck Turgeson's red telephone, which happens to be a direct line to the president, and the Russian spy whom the president invites into the war room to see the threat board. Therefore, the fact that Russians only drink vodka and the fact that Ripper will only drink either rainwater or grain alcohol suggests that there is a chemical as well as a character distinction being made between those who drink vodka, rainwater, and grain alcohol and those who drink fluoridated water. So if fluoride is synonymous with carelessness, then this would make vodka, rainwater, and grain alcohol the opposite of carelessness, which would be vigilance, which makes sense when you consider the fact that Ripper warned his soldiers on the base to be on the lookout for Russians pretending to be American soldiers, as the Russian Desadetsky is actually a spy pretending to be a Russian ambassador or something that he is not. But in addition to representing carelessness, fluoridated water is also analogous to the fatigue and emptiness that Ripper said he experiences after making love to women. Are there any other metaphors for fatigue and emptiness in this film? Yes. For instance, the fuel leaking out of the damaged bomber represents fatigue, as the plane, after dropping its nuclear bomb or load, represents the feeling of emptiness Ripper feels after making love to women. We can also apply Ripper's description of making love to the doomsday device, as the women that sense his essence and power are comparable to Russian radar sensing the American bombers in its airspace. Now we come to the supposedly lame Dr. Strangelove standing up at the end of the film. First, we know that Russia is contaminating America's drinking water with fluoride. We also know that Ripper denies women his essence, which is just another way of him saying that he pulls out prior to ejaculating, which is analogous to the recall code to call back the planes which Ripper sent to bomb Russia. And since, according to Ripper's conspiracy theory, the Russians are polluting America's water and body fluids with fluoride, and since Ripper also compares the fluids of his own body with power, and since this power, which he also refers to as his essence, is also an indirect reference to his genetic material, and since the expenditure of this genetic material during the act of love leaves him, he says, fatigued and empty, combined with his obsession with protecting the integrity of his body fluids, Ripper's fear of Russian infiltration is synonymous with Adolf Hitler's fear of Germany being weakened by the infusion of degenerate elements into his bloodstream. On September 15, 1935, the Nazi government created the Nuremberg laws, which outlawed race mixing between Aryans and Jews. Aryans suspected of having intimate relations with Jews, blacks, and gypsies were charged and tried in courts of law for defiling the Aryan race. Due to the falling birth rates of Germany's white population, the Nazis deviated from its original promise that every woman would have her own man in a monogamous relationship. Children born out of wedlock and promiscuous behavior, once a moral shame, became a source of moral pride and necessity under the Lebensborn program that encouraged pure-blooded Aryan males to breed with pure-blooded Aryan females in order to produce pure-blooded Aryan offspring. Heinrich Himmler, chief of the SS, wanted every SS officer to father an illegitimate child before leaving for war. Compare the Nazis' Lebensborn program with Strangelove's post-war vision of hand-picking women to breed with outnumbered men in order to repopulate the planet. Remember, Ripper bragged about how the women he made love with could sense his power. Also remember that power in this film is synonymous with masculinity, which Ripper says he denies women. And remember that masculinity in this film is also synonymous with the bomb, which sets off the doomsday machine, which also happens to be a metaphor for the female orgasm. Taking all of these into account, we should now see how Strangelove gets the power to stand and walk at the end of the film. For as I already pointed out, Hitler created the Nuremberg laws to purge the Aryan race of those classified as impure, which included those who were sick, weak, and deformed, while the Lebensborn program was also created to inbreed those whom Hitler considered pure, comparable with Strangelove's post-war scenario in which factors such as youth, health, fertility, intelligence, and skill sets would determine who would be selected to live and breed in the mine shafts and those who would be left to die of radioactive fallout on the surface after nuclear Armageddon. Therefore, Dr. Strangelove can no more control his impulse to walk and raise his supposedly dead arm to salute the president as the Fuhrer than Jack D. Ripper can control himself during the act of sex, the president can recall the planes from bombing Russia, or the doomsday machine can be untriggered after it has been triggered. Around the time that Stanley Kubrick got the idea to do a film about the Cold War, Alistair Buchan, head of the Institute for Strategic Studies, recommended Peter George's 1958 political thriller Red Alert. In late 1960, Kubrick and George started brainstorming ideas to reinterpret George's book into a film. The tone of George's book is serious and ends with the deactivation of Russia's doomsday device. Kubrick, however, wanted to adapt Peter George's book into a dark comedy ending in nuclear Armageddon. Kubrick acquired the rights to Peter George's novel in 1962 and brought in novelist, essayist, and screenwriter Terry Southern to help him write the script. Peter George left the project after an August 1964 photo essay in Life magazine suggested that Southern played a larger role in writing the script than himself. George wrote Life magazine to point out that Southern's role in writing the script was not only much smaller than the early article made it seem, but that he, George, had written the book that the script was based on. Ironically and sadly, Peter George took his own life 2 years after the release of the film. While filming Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick found out that another Cold War film was being produced called Failsafe, based on the 1962 novel of the same name by Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler. The film was so similar to Dr. Strangelove that Kubrick filed a plagiarism suit against the book's authors in order to stall the film's release. Meanwhile, Peter George won an out-of-court settlement against the authors of Failsafe. Peter George's settlement was successful due to the fact that his book Red Alert came out in 1958, 4 years before Failsafe, which came out in 1962. Even though Kubrick lost his lawsuit to get an injunction against Failsafe, his lawsuit convinced Columbia Pictures, which owned the distribution rights to both films, to delay Failsafe until Dr. Strangelove completed its theatrical run. And though Failsafe opened to critical acclaim, the film was perceived as a copycat and flopped at the box office. The fact that Dr. Strangelove had its first test screening on November 22nd, 1963, the day of John F. Kennedy's assassination, would seem a random coincidence if not for Slim Pickens' character in the film saying that a fella could have a pretty good weekend in Dallas, which happened to be where Kennedy's assassination took place. Consequently, the word Dallas was taken out of Major Kong's famous line and replaced with Las Vegas. Also taken out of the film was an alternate ending involving a pie fight in which General Turgidson says, "Gentlemen, our gallant young president has been struck down in his prime." But out of all the accidental references to John F. Kennedy's assassination that were taken out of the film's final cut, one reference to the late president remains in the film with the words "Dear John" painted on the nose of one of the bombs in Major Kong's plane. Unlike his realistic performance as veteran criminal Johnny Clay in Stanley Kubrick's 1956 film The Killing, Sterling Hayden's over-the-top performance as base commander Jack D. Ripper sets the tone for all of the acting performances throughout the film, such as George C. Scott, who plays General Buck Turgidson. Reportedly, Kubrick wanted Scott to play his role over the top like Sterling Hayden's character Jack D. Ripper. However, Scott didn't like Kubrick's idea and wanted to play the role realistically. Kubrick persuaded Scott to play his role over the top during rehearsals. But unknown to Scott, Kubrick filmed these takes and worked them into the actual film, which upset Scott, who vowed to never work with Kubrick again. And as ubiquitous as he is in Kubrick's 1962 dark comedy Lolita, playing 5 characters, a playwright, a cop, a psychologist, a photographer, and an anonymous caller, Peter Sellers is equally ubiquitous in Dr. Strangelove as British RAF officer Lionel Mandrake, President Merkin Muffley, the film's titular character, Dr. Strangelove, and he would have played 5 characters had he not injured his ankle getting out of his limo. Before Sellers' quote-unquote accident getting out of the limo, Kubrick wanted him to also play Major Kong, even though Sellers himself did not want to play the role because he was not sure if he could speak with a southern twang. The role ended up going to Slim Pickens, a California native and real-life rodeo performer who seemed perfect for the role. Other actors of note in Dr. Strangelove include Keenan Wynn as Colonel Bat Guano and James Earl Jones in his first film role as Lothar Zogg. Despite the fact that Dr. Strangelove was labeled as a black comedy, Kubrick was obsessed with authenticity. He commissioned his set designer Ken Adam to pattern the CRM receiver in the film's B-52 bombers after the U.S. military's Joint Electronics Type Designation System, or JETDS. Like the CRM device in the film, JETDS is a code communication system beginning with 3 letters designating where the equipment or system is used, what the equipment or system does, and the equipment or system's purpose. Hypothetically, the letter C of the CRM device in the film will be found and defined in the first table of the JETDS system under the word installation. The letter C in the JETDS system stands for cryptographic equipment. The letter R of the CRM device in the film will be found and defined in the second table of the JETDS system under the phrase type of equipment. The letter R in the JETDS system stands for radio, and the letter M of the CRM device in the film will be found and defined in the third table of the JETDS system under the word purpose. The letter M in the JETDS system stands for maintenance or test assemblies. Unable to access an actual B-52 to model the film's B-52 after, Kubrick's set designer Ken Adam constructed an interior mock-up of the B-52 with the help of photographs, blending elements of the B-29 Superfortress with elements of the B-52. The Doomsday device was also modeled on a real-life Soviet weapon system called Dead Hand, which was programmed to respond to a nuclear attack by launching intercontinental ballistic missiles from command posts throughout Russia. America even had its own Doomsday weapon system called ANDRC-8. Dr. Strangelove represents the third trimester of Stanley Kubrick's creative metamorphosis up to his death in 1999, with his first trimester being all of his films preceding his 1956 film noir The Killing. His second creative trimester would be his 1957 anti-war drama Paths of Glory and his 1962 comedy Lolita. In Paths of Glory, Kubrick focused on life and death, whereas his previous film The Killing focused on man's powerlessness over chance, while in Lolita, Kubrick focused on the dark side of human nature concerning a middle-aged college professor's obsession with an adolescent girl. And finally, Kubrick's third creative trimester would be his last black and white film, Dr. Strangelove, which paved the way for the birth of his first color film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And as there are many who consider 2001 the best of Kubrick's color films, I would argue that Dr. Strangelove is the best of his black and white films. Thanks for watching this video analysis of director Stanley Kubrick's 1964 satire, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. If you like this video, I would appreciate it if you would give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and hit the bell to be notified of future film analysis such as this one. Thanks again, and God bless.